Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing?
About you, Nick?
I'm pretty good. And also Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you?
Oh, okay. First show of the year for me.
Indeed, and hopefully we can make it an exciting and insightful one. First story we're going to talk about today is the pass rate. We're then going to talk about the resignation of a DAMP. And then we're going to finish off with a curious story about a man who had a lot of guns. So let's get into the pass rate. This is a thing that comes out every year, of course, around this time. There's lots of messages congratulating matrics and lots of focus on the mental health of matrics around the country. We saw the IEBs, private schools, matric results come out yesterday with a sort of, I think it was a 98% pass rate. We talked about it on the show yesterday. And now the government schools have released their matric results. And indeed, they are the highest ever recorded with the current National Senior Certificate certification for matric, an 82.9% matric pass rate, which is up 2.8 percentage points from last year. The number of bachelor passes, which is the sort of minimum requirement to be able to study at a university, places like UNISA, that kind of thing, has increased to 40%. So the bachelor's pass, considering that many of the pass rates have been lowered in other things, I think is a more accurate indication of kind of what we might call a more substantial indicator of what the actual state of the education system is. That is up though. The Free State, and this is what's kind of interesting, is for the second year in a row the best performing province in terms of passes, with 89% of candidates passing. KZN is in second place, Gauteng in third, and the Western Cape at fourth. It's also worth noting that, as usual, the various people have criticized these results. The DA says the real pass rate is closer to 52%, I think is the number they had, which includes people who dropped out of the education system before actually even writing their matric at all, which is a very significant number of people. And the RR has often pointed out over the years that if you are a young Black South African, only 5% of young Black South Africans will pass matric with over 50% in maths. I think the number is something like that, which is quite the indictment of the education system. Terence, let me start with you. What do you make of these results? What do you make of the fact that they are the best results that we've seen with the National Senior Certificate? And what do you think does this mean the education system is getting better? What do you think?
Well, I remember it was about 10 years ago, Jonathan Jansen said something to the effect of the release of the matric results is where South Africa performs annual ritual of congratulating itself for mediocrity. And I think, that's kind of where we are. It's positive, certainly on an individual level, that a greater proportion of people pass than they did previously. And maybe it's a little churlish, although I think it's the big picture requires one to look at all of those people who started off at starts in grade 1 and didn't make it all the way through. But I think that there's a few things going on here, that the education system is just not preparing people for the demands of the economy and call it a fulfilling life. Hence this mad dash. Everyone wants to go to university. That just it seems to me to just have things backwards. There hasn't been enough, not nearly enough emphasis put on vocational training. We have a very low uptake of entrepreneurship now. I think that's also one where there's also a complex matter. To go and start your own business is a lot easier said than done. And to be fair, there have been some movements within education, within South Africa's education environment to encourage that. I mean, that's why you have this economic and management sciences subject for at sort of mid school level. But yeah, as to whether this signifies anything more than itself, well, that's a long term thing. I just say I don't see this as a reason to get excited. Maybe if we're able to replicate this every year with small incremental improvements in the throughput and in those pass rates over time, that will be something to celebrate. But at the moment, it really just seems to be wheels spinning in the mud.
No, I think that's exactly right. Even if and the kind of depressing thing about this, Marius, is that even if the quality of education was good, and I think in many cases it really isn't. I think in a lot of cases this is sort of almost a box ticking exercise. The kids who come out of school are in a world with very few job opportunities. I think the youth unemployment rate is over 60%, something like that, for people just fresh out of school, which is why Terence says, everyone is trying to get to university. They just want that extra leg up to get somewhere in the economy. But it's really slim pickings. And, if you're a young person, particularly from a less privileged background in South Africa today, the future doesn't look particularly bright. What do you make of all this?
I mean, that's exactly it. There's not too much to add to that. I think you're right. The youth unemployment rate of people under 25, whatever it is around about 60 or 65%. I mean, it's absolutely shocking. And doesn't matter how good education is getting provided, if there aren't job opportunities, then it's not going to help you. But I suppose these two things are kind of related: the poor education system and the poor economy. Poor education system is because of problems in management and management of the education system and all kinds of other complex issues. But just on the issue of the standard of matric pass, when South Africa has taken part in these kind of international rating exercises, the TIMS, where they look at how well kids do at maths and science, and the PEARLs, which is about reading and literacy. I can't remember exactly what those acronyms stand for, but TIMS is for maths and science and PEARLs is for reading. South Africa is almost always right at the bottom, or they don't look at every single country in the world. They normally look at about 40 countries, normally kind of middle income and upper income countries. And South Africa is, as I say, almost always the last out of, say, 40 or 45, or second or third last. And it's countries that, it'll be, I think Kenya is normally below us. I think I've seen a couple of times some Arab countries have been below us. But overall, we do really badly. And it's also just it's a distraction of human capital. If you aren't getting decent education when you're young, you're already on the back foot as you get older. And especially a thing like early childhood development. From what I've read, that is actually one of the most important education stages in your life, where you go from like the ages of 4 to 7, whatever the case is, before you start formal schooling. If kids haven't gone to a decent kind of nursery school, you don't have to be taught how to read, but just all kinds of things that give you a very good foundation for later on in life. And a lot of kids don't get that, and they're already on the back foot when they start going to grade 1 and what have you. And I see there's a comment here from somebody who's called Grasshopper. Don't think that's the real name, but it could be. It says a large portion of teachers don't even understand the subjects they were meant to teach. And I think that's also right. From what I've read, often South African teachers get given kind of problems that a grade 6 or standard 4 should be able to solve. And the teachers themselves can't do it. And that's kind of thing, if you're teaching maths to, say, grade 6s, you should be able to do like maths problems in your sleep. I mean, if you're teaching matric maths, you should be able to do these problems in your sleep. So that's also where the problem comes from, and it's also the influence of SATU. And yeah, it's a very complex problem and a very big one for South Africa.
So considering that this is a complex problem, Terence, if you were to fix these problems, what would you do?
Oh yeah, I'd contact Hogwarts and get them to cast a spell on South Africa. Look, this is difficult stuff. I think that one of the key difficulties, I think, is that most South African students are going through an education that's not taught in their home language, and I don't quite know how you sort of how you deal with that in a society like South Africa. But I do think that there are some very important, let's say, social and political circumstances that need to be. But what we've also had is a situation where teaching was considered like it was one of the very few sort of accessible white collar occupations to black people in the past. So you had a lot of people who did not have the temperament or really the interest going into teaching because that was what was available. And I think the problem is that post 1994, it's been used as a sort of patronage tool. I mean, state capturing education departments was a big issue, and as far as I can ascertain, nothing has been done about that. I also think that Marius is quite correct about early education. Students can demonstrate and be heard, and this becomes the cause du jour. But whether your degree in sociology is as useful either to your own labor market mobility or to society as a whole, as opposed to taking those resources and putting them into 10 sort of 5-6-year-olds, that is a real question. And those 5 or 6-year-olds don't have that sort of organization behind them. They don't get onto ENCA. They don't get to make speeches quoting Frantz Fanon and become the subjects of university seminars. So yeah, much more focus on those sort of early years. And I would say, given the limitations we do have, we should focus on things like literacy, numeracy. We spent 20 years experimenting with outcomes-based education and blah 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 blah. Where we didn't have the human resources or the physical infrastructure to make those sort of things possible. One can argue about whether they were good ideas, but they were just never sort of workable. I remember Cotter Osmal saying, well, rote learning does nothing for the intellect, but if rote learning can get you to read at least that is something you have. I mean, we have. I've been stunned sometimes with what I've seen with high school students, and these are not in deprived township schools, just the inability to put a sentence together. I don't know. Also, kids must read. They must read more than they, watch YouTube videos. See, guys, read my stuff. Don't just watch me on the Daily Friend show.
And you can, of course, do that at thedailyfriend.co.za. But
on Monday,
I really like your point. I'm looking forward to that. I really like your point, Terence, about the sort of overemphasis of the issue on students. I think something like 10% around there percent of South Africans have a tertiary level education. Something like 6% for university degrees, and the rest are diplomas or other higher certifications. If you are the kind of person who manages to get into university, it doesn't mean that your life problems are anywhere close to being solved or that you're not going to be unemployed or anything like that. But it does mean that you're actually much higher in the system and in your chances of success than someone who, shall we say, doesn't even write matric, which is a very significant number of people. And more focus
for
on the
people
low
with
level.
degrees. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah, and as you say, Terence, more focus for people at the lower ends of the education system, in primary school and pre-primary school and high school. That's really what we need if we actually want to get the country well educated.
Yeah, I just want to say that unemployment for people with degrees is much lower than overall unemployment. It's still higher than it should be, but it's between 10 and 15%, which for developed countries high, but for South Africa, that's if we had 10% unemployment in South Africa, this country would be a very different place.
And that's exactly why, as we covered on the show on Wednesday, there were 120,000 applications for University of KZN, which only has 9,000 spots. Exactly because people see the difference that a degree makes, and they're desperately trying to get one. Okay, let's move on to our next story. And this is about the resignation of Ghaleb Cachalia, who I believe was the DA spokesperson on public enterprises. I think I'm correct in saying. I'm not 100% sure. I need to check that. But he was the spokesperson until, according to the DA, he violated an internal caucus decision by commenting on the war in Gaza. And he was fired from the shadow cabinet. He's now resigned from the party, saying that he thought that the party was going to try and prevent him from getting back as a member of parliament. He complains that he attempted to mediate with the leadership and that this was ignored. And he says that basically his relationship kind of broke down with the party, and he feels as though the party leadership has become authoritarian and not particularly democratic. I think this is a sad loss for the DA because he was, in my opinion, one of the more effective MPs in Parliament. But Terence, it's kind of interesting that we were talking about this in the pre-show discussion, and you point out, of course, correctly that South Africa has very little impact on the conflict in Gaza. And even more than that, an opposition party has even less conflict, and yet it still is such a divisive issue for so many South Africans, particularly in the DA. Actually, it seems to always cause internal friction in that party.
Look, I think I think my words have been South Africa has no influence there whatsoever. This is all. I think that for the ANC and the South African state, which I think it's difficult to tell them apart most of the time, but this kind of lets the ANC be what it really wants to be. It's a liberation movement, valiantly struggling for the liberation of yada 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 yada. A country that can't keep the lights on, is just sort of bankrupted itself through its own foolishness and venality, is not a compelling international actor. But all countries take global positions. But yeah, look, there is nothing that the DA can do about this publicly. Possibly the Western Cape government could make some sort of statement the way it's done about Ukraine or the city of Cape Town, but it's performative. But yeah, look, it is one of those things that for whatever set of reasons, and we could probably have a whole show just to discuss that, a lot of South Africans feel very very powerfully about. I like to introduce whatever interventions I might make on the subject by saying, as the only South African who is not an expert on the Middle East, I'd like to make the following comment. Because, part of this probably comes down to ethnic or religious identifications. Misplaced, in my view, links between, or associations between South Africa and the between South Africa's history and that of the Palestinians. It does seem to me, though, that for the DA this is a uniquely difficult problem, because I think that at some level it's kind of accepted that there's really no way to win here. But there's this sort of demand from particular hardcores in their constituencies to take a position. No position you take is going to satisfy everyone, and trying to split the difference or adopt, I think Marius called it a milquetoast position, is going to sort of irritate everyone. For me, though, what I would say about about Cachalia's position is that if you wade through the very extensive documentation and letters that he's written, what comes out there is this challenge to what he considers autocracy, democratic centralism. Obviously that's put in there for a reason. The DA as a liberal party, should it be restricting what what its leaders can say as private citizens? And that's a question. Is that viable or not? Marius, what do you think?
Marius, yeah. So, firstly, Marius, what do you think on that question? But secondly, it's always interesting to me how, when you sort of ask like voters or even politicians what their biggest issues are, they'll never list foreign policy stuff as near the top of that list. And yet, in many countries in the world, foreign policy issues tend to, I think, be some of the most emotive. And I think part of the reason for that is often when there's, especially when there's actually nothing necessarily practical to do, they kind of become stand-ins for your larger worldview and sort of moral framework and all that kind of stuff. And so they take on a sort of intensity that I think if you were just looking at everything very coldly and sort of rationally, doesn't seem that obvious. But you see this as well in the United States, where people will never list foreign policy issues at the top of their list, but then will sometimes get the most furious about a foreign policy issue, regardless of what position they take on it. What do you make of all this, Marius?
Yeah, I think these kind of policy things are often a shorthand to signal where you kind of stand with things. So, I mean, taking the Ukraine-Russia war, if you're somebody who decided you're on the side of Russia, for example, you're either going to say against the NATO and the WEF and George Soros and that, or that you on the side of ANC and the kind of non-Western foreign policy. And if you said you're on the side of Ukraine, then you're more on kind of the Atlanticism and the liberal world order and all that kind of thing. I think it's similar when you'd say, if you're not an American, you say who you're supporting in the American election. It's kind of just shorthand to identify what kind of tribe you're in. And I think it's quite similar with this Israel and Palestine issue. I mean, it's obviously a very emotive issue. I'm also with Terence. I try not to comment too much on this. I think both sides have quite strong points, but yeah, I mean, what happened on 7th October was obviously terrible, but I also feel really, for people who are living in Gaza who, don't support Hamas, I think what's happening to them is also awful. So it's all, it's a mess all around. But on the issue of foreign policy, I mean, it seems to be, as you said, it's a very emotive topic, but I don't know how many people's votes in South Africa are going to be turned on foreign policy. I don't know how many people now who are sitting in the dark and hut full of load shedding and, there's sewage pouring down the street. They decided already 2 or 3 years ago they're not going to vote ANC and they're going to, maybe give the DA a go or, one of the new parties or whatever. I don't know how many of these people are going to look at South Africa supporting coming out strongly on the side of Palestine and going to the ICJ and all that, and then deciding to change their vote back to the ANC because of what the South African government's done with regard to Israel and so on. So it's I don't know how much it's going to be. It fills up newspaper columns and gets people very hot under the collar on social media and all that kind of thing. And also at the same time, we've got to remember that there are real people who died on the 7th October and real people who are getting killed in Gaza and having their homes destroyed. So, it's not just headlines. It's what's happening and what has happened in the Middle East. It's real people being affected. But just on the issue of Cachalia as well, I think he's also in a tricky position. He's he was a representative of the DA. And if you're a public representative, you pretty much got to go along with what the party line is. And, if he, obviously he's allowed to have his own opinion and so on. And if the party decided that what you were saying was going against what the party said, then maybe they also did the right thing. But then at the same time, I have to say, give kudos to Cachalia for, standing by his principles and resigning from his position and from his job. He's obviously, for now, he's unemployed. So, and he decided to put his principles first. So also good for him. But I think it's one of those, neither party's really hasn't really covered themselves in glory in this whole issue at the moment.
I'd just like to point out there was actually one of the ANC's very, very few Jewish she wasn't a public rep, but she was like a publicly known supporter who was she quit over this, saying that the ANC has shown no empathy for Jewish people, and saying that she's become tired of simply being identified by, where do you stand on this? No, very, very very, very sad and upsetting. Look, a guy grew up in South Africa, but now is now a long-term resident of the United States. Actually, I asked him what he thought about America's position on Ukraine, what ordinary Americans that he interacts with thinks. He said, "Look, most of them can get very emotional about it, but this is as long as they don't see it affecting their lives. That's where you'll see position shifting when this is a case of you pay more tax because you need to buy more hardware to ship to Ukraine. So yeah, then you can start to see these sort of things falling apart."
All right, let's move on to our last topic, and this is the arrest of a man in Mpumalanga for having a large number of firearms stored at his house. 106 firearms. Most of them were pistols, but I think there were 14 rifles and 8 shotguns. Also, as 1,700 rounds of ammunition. The story doesn't entirely make clear exactly what the circumstances of this are. It does seem as though this guy was involved with a private security firm, I think a fairly small one. And then the implication I got from the story, although it is not said in the story, this is that he was maybe like storing these weapons for his private security company or something like that. Some of them had expired licenses, and all of them were stored. I believe the regulations say that you have to store a firearm in a safe. All of them were stored under his bed in suitcases, which is, I'm not super big on like heavy firearms regulation, but it doesn't seem like having 100 guns under your bed is a great idea. Terence, let me start again with you. The sort of larger issue here is the contentious Firearms Control Act. Government passed this, and as far as I'm concerned, it has been a complete failure. It hasn't really done anything except make life very difficult for legal gun owners, whilst not really cutting into the enormous number of illegal firearms in the country. A number which no one has any sort of definitive idea of how big that number is, but it is quite large. From the
there's a lot of them around, yeah. Well, look, I looked at some of the photographs of this guy's house, and like the suitcase with pistols just spilling out of it. There's been a concept in South African law for a long, long time, which is unfit to possess a firearm. I can't help thinking that a guy who just has, like sort of 102 gets like stuffed in suitcases under his bed qualifies as fit to possess a firearm. Look, my view on this, is that I'm not in favor of the sort of American right to bear arms thing. But I do think that private citizens should have a legal right if they meet certain thresholds. One of which I think is the ability to safeguard the gun. I don't think that's unreasonable. I think if it's on your possession, it should be locked away. Forget about these getting into the hands of numbers gangs in the Cape Flats. There's the question of a 5-year-old thinking this is a nice toy and pulling the trigger. That's a thing. This, no. I'm stunned. And apparently he reckons that he can't account for 20 of them. I'm amazed he can actually account for the rest. If there was like a walk-in safe with these all sort of stacked on shelves or something, this just seems like carelessness of the highest order.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is the
lock
sort of
them in your fridge, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that does seem like a better place to store them. I mean, when the police asked him, they had a list of firearms I think he was supposed to own or something like that, and he said that he could, as you mentioned, Terence, could not account for 20 of them, which is this guy is giving people, because it doesn't seem clear that he was going to sell these to. It doesn't look like he was going to sell these to criminals or anything like that, at least from the story here. But still, I think not a good look for firearm owners. Marius, what do you make of this? it's kind of an amusing story, but I think it's just scratching the surface of the number of illegal firearms in the country.
It's one of those funny stories that you probably only really get in South Africa. And yeah, I'm also, I mean, I'm not as much of a gun nut as the two of you, I don't think. But I think you should be allowed to have a firearm, but also I don't think you should be keeping 100 of them under your bed. So, but yeah.
I mean, not under your bed, but in your safe. I wouldn't mind keeping 100 firearms in my safe.
I don't know, there's not too much to say about
100
this.
properly registered and safeguarded firearms would be okay.
I don't know. Why does anybody need 100 guns, though, to be honest? I mean, maybe 10 or something, but like, you only got 2 hands, right?
So, why do you need a car with 4 doors there, Marius?
What if you want somebody to? That's ridiculous. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much you can really say more about this, but it's just one of those funny stories that I think you only get in this country, really. And it's probably pretty good Friday story, I suppose.
So I see someone is asking why the police came and looking under his bed. Apparently, someone tipped them off to this fact that he had a huge number of firearms. Presumably, someone
probably visited him and tripped over a case full of firearms and thought, "Oh well, this is weird."
It's just sort of tripped over it, and then guns just sort of spilling out of the open case, and he was like, "Ooh." But I'm sure that also another detail of the story: the guy who was arrested here is 67 years old.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think this is the kind of guy who's about to, charge through the door of the local discount and demand all the prescription medication. But it's just like, please lock your guns up.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, that is, I think, all the time we have for today. We hope that you found the show interesting. We will be back on Monday with the Daily Friend Show. Have a great weekend, everyone. Cheers.